6:18 a.m., every bridge on the planet stopped being a bridge. Not collapsed, not cracked, transformed, mid-structure, mid-load, mid-purpose, into something that still held its exact shape, but no longer behaved like steel, concrete, or stone. I was standing at the midpoint of the Halden Crossing, the pedestrian bridge that arched over the rail yards on my walk to work, when the entire structure beneath my feet turned to glass in less time than it takes to blink. I felt it in my shoes first, a strange, sudden coldness radiating up through the soles, like the ground itself had exhaled something arctic. Then the sound, not a crack, not a groan of failing metal, but a single, resonant chime, high and clear, like someone had struck a massive tuning fork somewhere beneath the bridge deck. I looked down, and the worn asphalt path I'd walked 1,000 mornings before had become a smooth, glowing sheet of translucent glass, and through it, impossibly, I could see straight down to the rail yard 40 feet below, the tracks and gravel and rusted signal boxes all frozen in perfect, magnified clarity beneath my feet. My name is Sora. This is the day every bridge on Earth turned to glass, and somehow, I was standing at the center of one when it happened. In this episode of Anime Echo Tales, I want to take you through everything. The moment it happened, what we learned about why, and what it cost the world in the hours and days that followed. Let me back up, because you need to understand what an ordinary Thursday looked like before I tell you how it ended. I lived on the north side of the city, in a neighborhood cut off from downtown by the rail yards, which meant bridges weren't a convenience for me. They were the only way in or out. I crossed the Halden Crossing every single morning on foot, and I drove across the Kensington Viaduct every evening to get home. I worked as a structural inspector for the city's transportation department, which meant I spent my career thinking about bridges in a way most people never do. Load ratings, fatigue stress, expansion joints, the quiet, constant war every bridge wages against gravity and time. I respected bridges the way some people respect old-growth trees. They looked permanent. They were built to look permanent. That illusion is, I think, the whole reason this day broke something in almost everyone who lived through it. That morning, I had my inspection tablet in hand, walking the Halden Crossing not for work, but simply because it was my route, thinking about nothing more dramatic than whether I'd have time to grab coffee before my first site visit. I stepped onto the bridge deck at 6:17 a.m. At 6:18 a.m., every bridge on the planet stopped being made of the materials that built them. The glass beneath me wasn't simple or flat. That detail still unsettles me more than almost anything else from that day. I preserved every texture the original structure carried, the seams between concrete panels, the rivet heads on the old steel trusses, even a long crack that had been patched with asphalt sealant years before I ever started working for the department, now visible as a faint discoloration frozen inside the glass itself, like an insect trapped in amber. It looked less like a bridge that had failed, and more like a photograph of a bridge, rendered suddenly, impossibly, in 3 dimensions and full structural form. I did the only thing that made sense to a man who had spent a decade being professionally suspicious of any structure behaving strangely. I got down on one knee and pressed my palm flat against the railing. It was warm, the way skin is warm, not the way cold steel or stone should ever be. I could feel a faint vibration running through it too, not mechanical, more like the hum you feel with your hand flat against a speaker playing something too low to properly hear. I want you to understand what this meant on a planetary scale, because in that first disorienting minute, I could only process the bridge directly beneath me. But bridges don't exist in isolation any more than rivers do. Every city on Earth depends on them, for commuters, for freight, for emergency access, for water and power lines routed along their spans, for the simple, invisible assumption that the shortest path between 2 points usually crosses over something. In a single instant, at 6:18 a.m. adjusted precisely for every time zone on the planet, meaning this didn't spread with sunrise the way a natural event would, but struck everywhere on Earth simultaneously. The Golden Gate stopped being steel. The Brooklyn Bridge stopped being steel and stone. The Akashi Kaikyo, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, The countless smaller highway overpasses and pedestrian crossings and railway trestles that never made international news at all. Every one of them, everywhere, transformed in the same heartbeat. My phone showed no signal, the particular kind of nothing that comes from every tower within reach, being overwhelmed at once by 8 billion people trying to process the same impossible thing in the same impossible second. I made my way carefully off the Halden Crossing. Carefully, because despite how solid it felt underfoot, some deep animal part of my brain refused to fully trust glass to hold my weight the way steel and concrete always had. And once I reached solid ground, I turned back to look at what I'd just crossed. From a distance, it was breathtaking in a way that made my stomach twist. The entire bridge glowed faintly, catching the early light and scattering it in long refracted lines across the rail yard below, beautiful in the exact way that something deeply wrong can still, somehow, also be beautiful. By the time I reached the Transportation Department's regional office, the parking lot was already full of colleagues who hadn't gone inside. Priya Anand, the department's chief structural engineer, and the person who trained me when I first started this job, was standing near the entrance, gripping her own tablet so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She looked up when she saw me and said the words that would define the rest of that day for both of us. It's not just Halden, it's not just this city, every bridge, everywhere, at the exact same second. I asked her the only question that made sense. How do you even begin assessing something like this at a planetary scale? She turned her tablet toward me. Emergency feeds, pulled from every transportation authority and satellite imaging service willing to share data in the chaos of that morning, showed the same pattern replicated across every inhabited continent. Bridges that had shown up as ordinary gray infrastructure in imagery from 30 minutes earlier now glowed faintly on thermal and optical sensors alike, registering material properties that matched nothing in any engineering database on record. We spent the next several hours doing the only thing engineers know how to do when the impossible happens directly in front of them. We tried to measure it, test it, find some internal logic that would make it make sense. Priya's team confirmed what my own hand had already told me on the Halden Crossing. Whatever this material was, it wasn't simply steel and concrete that had crystallized through some freak process. A colleague ran a portable material analyzer against a sample chipped, with enormous difficulty, from the edge of a smaller pedestrian bridge nearby, and the readings didn't match silica glass, didn't match any crystalline structure in any reference library the department had access to. It was as if every bridge on the planet had been asked a single question: remain what you were built from, or become something else entirely, and every structure, everywhere, had answered identically in the same instant. Buildings were unaffected. Roads leading up to bridge approaches remained ordinary asphalt, right up until the exact point where the span itself began. Dams, oddly, were untouched too, despite being structurally similar to bridges in some engineering respects, which told Priya's team something important early on. Whatever defined the trigger wasn't simply large human-made structure. It was specifically structures built to span a gap, to connect one point to another across empty space below. Load-bearing connective architecture in the truest sense. Bridges qualified. Elevated highways that ran continuously over solid ground, even on pylons, mostly did not, except for the specific spans where they crossed rivers, ravines, or rail lines. The parts of the highway that were functionally, structurally, bridges themselves, even without the name. By mid-morning, the human cost of the transformation had begun revealing itself in ways that went far beyond the eerie beauty of the glass itself. Emergency vehicles across the world found entire response routes severed, forced into detours that added hours to critical response times in cities built around river crossings and valley spans. Rail networks that depended on bridge crossings for both passenger and freight service ground to a halt entirely. Trains stopped dead at the mouths of transformed trestles. Engineers unwilling to test whether the glass would bear the exact same loads the original steel had carried for 100 years. Priya's team ran the first weight tests that afternoon on a smaller, low-traffic footbridge, and the results were almost more unsettling than if the glass had simply failed outright. It held. It held loads far beyond what the original structure had been rated for, as if whatever had built this material had improved on the original engineering, rather than simply mimicking its shape. I want to tell you about the moment the true scale of this hit me personally, because it wasn't the emergency broadcasts or the material analysis. It was a call, one cell signal finally stabilized enough to get through, from my younger brother, who lived across the river in the part of the city only reachable by the Kessington Viaduct, the same bridge I drove across every single evening to get home. He told me he'd been sitting in traffic on that exact viaduct when it happened, stopped at a red light 3 cars back from the transformation's leading edge, and he'd watched the entire bridge deck ahead of him change in real time, the cars in front of him rolling to an instinctive stop as their drivers stared through windshields at asphalt turning, section by section, into something that glowed faintly even in daylight. He asked me the question everyone was asking everyone else that day, the question none of us had an answer for yet. Why bridges? Why now? Why everywhere all at once, with absolutely no warning? I didn't have an answer for him that morning, but by early afternoon, Priya's wider network, structural engineers, geologists, and a handful of physicists who'd started comparing notes the moment the global scope became undeniable, had found a thread worth pulling. A seismic monitoring station in a mountain research post, running routine ground vibration sampling, had recorded an anomalous signal roughly 9 minutes before the transformation reached that region. Not a typical seismic event. A rhythmic, structured pulse propagating through solid rock at a speed and pattern that didn't match any known tectonic activity, moving with a deliberate, almost musical regularity that one of the physicists, in a briefing note Priya read aloud to me later that day, described as resembling less a natural tremor and more something closer to a struck resonant frequency, deliberately tuned. The timing lined up precisely. 9 minutes before the transformation reached that mountain research station, the pulse had passed directly beneath it, and unlike the ocean-based signal that reportedly preceded the river transformation weeks before, a story I'd only heard secondhand, the way most of us had heard about other impossible things happening to other people in other places. This pulse seemed to move specifically through solid ground, through bedrock, through the very foundations that every bridge on Earth was ultimately anchored into. Meaning, whatever caused this hadn't simply broadcast outward from one location, it had traveled the load-bearing skeleton of the planet itself, finding every structure built to bridge a gap and answering with the same transformation, everywhere, in perfect synchronization. That evening, I went back to the Halden Crossing. I told myself it was for a proper inspection, the kind of professional excuse that let me stand somewhere without admitting I simply needed to see it again, now that the shock of the morning had thinned into something heavier and quieter. The neighborhood around the bridge had gone unnervingly still, in the way places go still after something happens that nobody has language for yet. People gathered in small clusters on porches and stoops, nobody quite ready to go back inside and pretend the day had been ordinary, everyone glancing periodically toward the bridge, like it might do something else if they looked away too long. The glass caught the last of the evening light exactly the way it had caught the dawn that morning, scattering it into long fractured lines across the rail yard below. I walked to the midpoint again, the exact spot where I'd been standing when it happened, and crouched down to press my palm flat against the deck. Still warm, still carrying that strange skin-like heat that made no sense for a material that had, 12 hours earlier, been ordinary asphalt and steel rebar. Priya found me there almost an hour later. She didn't say much at first, just sat down on the low railing beside me with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent an entire day trying to explain the unexplainable to people desperate for an answer she didn't have. Eventually she told me what her broader network had pieced together by that point. Monitoring stations on 4 different continents had detected the same rhythmic ground pulse, all originating from different points that, when mapped together on a global model her team had rushed to build that afternoon, didn't suggest a single source at all. It looked instead like something vast and distributed, embedded across the planet's crust in sections, activating in a sequence too fast for human perception to register as anything but simultaneous. The same unsettling pattern the ocean researchers had described weeks earlier with the rivers, just expressed through stone instead of water. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since that morning, the one I hadn't said aloud until then. Do you think this is connected to the rivers? Do Do you think something out there is working through every load-bearing system the planet depends on, one category at a time? And if it is, what's supposed to come next? She didn't answer right away. She looked out at the glass bridge, at the way its arch held its exact original shape despite being made of something none of us understood. And she said the thing I've turned over in my mind nearly every day since. Bridges are how humanity refuses to let a gap stop it. A valley, a river, a rail yard, distance itself. If something out there wanted to make 8 billion people confront how much of their world depends on connections they'd stopped consciously noticing, transforming every bridge on Earth simultaneously was, in a strange and almost elegant way, the most efficient method imaginable. We never received an explanation, not that night, not in the weeks that followed. No further pulses were detected after that day. No message arrived, no demand, nothing that resembled communication in any language anyone recognized. Governments convened emergency infrastructure sessions. Engineers across the world began the painstaking work of testing whether temporary structures could be built alongside the glass spans, or whether new load ratings needed to be established for the strange, uncannily strong material that refused to crack, corrode, or show any sign of fatigue in the weeks of stress testing that followed. Some smaller bridges were eventually reinforced with adjacent temporary crossings, allowing traffic to flow around rather than across the transformed spans. But the great bridges, the Golden Gate, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Halden Crossing that I walked across every morning of my working life, remained exactly as they were that Thursday morning, monuments now as much as infrastructure, visited by engineers, tourists, and quietly grieving locals in roughly equal measure. I still work for the transportation department, though the job asks something different of me now than it used to. I spend most of my time on what we've started calling the Continuity Project, mapping and designing temporary spans that let the city function around the glass bridges rather than depending on them the way we once did without a second thought. It's slower, more careful work than structural inspection used to be. It asks for a kind of humility I didn't have before that Thursday. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I still walk out to the Halden Crossing before heading to the office. The same route I've walked for years, the same bridge I was standing on when it happened. The glass hasn't changed in all this time. No cracking, no dulling, no sign that whatever transformed it plans to ever let it return to what it was. I run my hand along the railing and look down through the transparent deck at the rail yard below, at the exact structure the bridge was wearing in the half second before it stopped being steel and concrete at all. And I think about Priya's theory, the one she never quite finished saying out loud that evening on the railing, but that I know we were both circling. Maybe it wasn't a warning. Maybe it wasn't even meant for us specifically at all. Maybe it was simply a question, asked everywhere at once, in the only language broad enough to reach every person on the planet in the same instant. Not words, because words fracture across 1,000 languages and get lost in translation and argument. Just structure, transformed everywhere simultaneously, forcing 8 billion people to look down at the ground beneath their feet, and their cars and their morning commutes, and wonder, together, whether the connections they'd always assumed would simply hold might not, someday, hold the same way again. I don't know if we'll ever get a real answer. I don't know if there's anyone out there who owes us one. But I know that every morning now, when I cross that bridge, I stop for a moment longer than I used to, and I look down at the glass beneath my feet, and I think about every bridge I ever inspected and signed off on, without truly appreciating what it meant, that it simply, quietly, reliably held. I was standing at the center of the world's bridges when they all, simultaneously, stopped being what they were built from. I don't think I'll ever fully understand why, but I understand now, in a way I never did before that Thursday, exactly how much weight we quietly place on the things that connect us, and how strange it is to keep crossing them anyway, every single day, trusting them completely, right up until the moment you can't. If this story pulled you in, this is exactly what we do every week here on Anime Echo Tales. One impossible moment, one person standing at the center of it, trying to make sense of a world that changed in a single second. If you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, And let me know in the comments which bridge in your own life you'd want to see frozen in glass like this one, and what you think that pulse moving through solid ground was really trying to say.